Did you know you can save up to 70% on the best brands just by shopping at FromRebel.com? We're talking about strollers, car seats, high chairs, espresso machines, cookware, everything you need for way less. Here's how it works. Every single day, Rebel drops thousands of new products on the site for up to 70% off. It is a constant stream of endless deals from top brands like UPPAbaby, Nuna, Baby Bjorn, Breville, Nespresso, KitchenAid, Le Creuset, and more. But you have to act fast because every deal is one of a kind. So if you see something you love, make sure you add to cart fast. So stop paying full price when you don't have to. Whether it's baby gear, kitchen upgrades, or a treasure for your home you didn't know you needed, Rebel has it for way less, up to 70% less. Shop from Rebel.com and save big.
If you haven't heard of GLP-1 drugs before, chances are you still might have seen ads about them.
They say GLP-1s for weight loss is a shortcut. It's not. It's science.
These drugs have recently become widely marketed and available as a weight loss medication, primarily for diabetic or obese patients.
GLP-1s helped me lose 31 pounds.
Because it is so effective, and the fact that we as a society are trapped by the prison of body image, lots of people have taken up using GLP-1s for weight loss.
Something like 1 in 8 Americans now take GLP-1s to address concerns around weight, obesity, and diabetes.
But, as Globe reporter Chris Sayers tells me, the drug could also be very promising for another reason.
That they could really do a lot to alleviate addictions, and not just one type of addiction, but essentially all of them.
So today, we're talking all about GLP-1s and their potential to help curb addiction. I'm Jasmine Aguilera, and this is The Globe. Joining me is Chris Sayers, a reporter on the Health Desk who writes about addiction. So, Chris, could you explain to me a little bit about what GLP-1s are and what they're used for primarily?
So GLP-1s were developed in the mid-aughts, primarily to address concerns around obesity and diabetes. What the medications do is they produce this natural hormone in the gut that helps regulate blood sugar and digestion. It's known as I'm going to get a little scientific here.
That's all right.
That's all right. But it's known as the glucagon-like peptide, the GLP-1. Essentially what it does is this hormone makes you feel full. So your appetite goes away, your cravings for food are diminished significantly. And because of that, they've become hugely popular.
So how did you come across this connection between this weight loss drug and addiction?
Well, there's been this kind of steady dribble of scientific studies looking at these medications and how they address other health conditions. And I just started to notice, mid to late last year that there were a number of studies that suggested that they could really do a lot to alleviate addictions, and not just one type of addiction, not just, say, alcohol or opioids or tobacco, but essentially all of them. Some of the more interesting studies, what they did is they basically looked at thousands of health records of people that have been prescribed medications like Ozempic for, say, diabetes, and looked at those health records to determine, say, the incidence in which they had developed alcohol use disorder or the incidence at which they had developed other types of addictions. And what they were finding in analyzing these health records was that there was a dramatic reduction in the numbers of people on these medications that were actually developing these addictions, and not small reductions, but quite significant. There's a huge public interest in this. I mean, something like 80,000 people a year in this country are still dying of opioid-related overdoses. And then 170,000 are dying of alcohol use disorder. So there's 250,000 people right there in this country that are, dying each year of addiction-related causes. So yeah, I try to stay on top of these studies in part because, there's huge life-saving implications, especially if you have something that could potentially, be a game changer, which I think GLP-1s are.
So in my mind, I'm thinking GLP-1s kind of just crush the need to want to eat. And maybe with this connection, it's more that it crushes cravings, the feeling of craving, period.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's an addiction physician that I interviewed in Providence that I thought put it beautifully. I mean, he said addiction is like a record playing in your mind over and over and over again, like on a constant loop. And what these medications do is they lift that needle just long enough that you can play a different song. And I think that really captures what these medications do. So I started to notice those research studies, and around about, January, I heard about this program through a Providence-based nonprofit called Open Doors that houses women who have struggled with addiction that are in recovery. Many of the women have formerly been incarcerated for drug-related crimes, and they said that they had started to provide these GLP-1s to some of the women, not as part of a scientific study, but just because they felt like it might do some good. And I thought, well, this is interesting enough that I'd like to meet some of these women. Some of these women had struggled for a decade or longer with addiction, trying to get their lives back together, relapsing. Relapse is, part of the nature of recovery. And they were searching for something that could just provide them some stability. And so, we met with a woman in Providence. Tragically, her son had been removed from her care because she had gotten to the point with her drinking that she was passing out, and Child Protective Services were concerned enough about the safety of her son that they removed him. She had started to get her life back together. She was in a home in Providence that provided some stability and supports. But what the GLP-1s did was kind of give her that extra stability that enabled her to avoid that craving that she felt literally every single hour, to go to the liquor store and buy that bottle. And so now she's reunited with her son. She got her certificate to be a certified nursing assistant. She's moved into her own apartment. Now, mind you, not all of this can be attributed to, the medications themselves. It took a lot of willpower and courage on her part, and she was in recovery prior to being prescribed it. But she really feels like it put her on a really safe path to that point. And, we interviewed some other women with different substance use disorders. One woman who had been using cocaine and crack cocaine for, 15 years. And she really said the effects were transformative and immediate, essentially within days after starting to take GLP-1s. The woman I interviewed said that it didn't completely eliminate their cravings, but it sort of quieted their brain enough that they could look at why they, say, wanted to drink or why they wanted to take cocaine or heroin in a very rational way and be able to think it through. You probably have heard the phrase that addiction hijacks your mind, and that's a bit of a cliche, but it's very much true. I mean, it's the nature of addiction, and, I have friends and relatives that have struggled with it. It really takes over your life in a way that I think a lot of folks can't fully appreciate. I mean, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, every stressor in your life is another kind of trigger to use. Plus, we live in a world in which we're surrounded by triggers, and it's really difficult to avoid those triggers and to stay sober. So what this does is it just kind of quiets the noise in your brain enough that you can think that through.
Wow. So why isn't this drug being marketed this way or prescribed this way in like a way that has hit the mainstream?
That's a great question. The drugs were developed initially to address obesity and diabetes, and that's a huge market. So I think, the big drug companies saw that huge market and the potential there, and so they developed their clinical trials around those markets. To be quite frank, the market for people who are addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol isn't perceived as attractive as the market for those who are struggling with weight issues. And so the potential for it to address other forms of addiction wasn't fully known until just recently. But now they're discovering through, some of these clinical trials that are starting that it doesn't just affect that hormone that we talked about, but it also affects receptors in the brain that essentially govern your motivation and reward system. And so that goes well beyond simply addressing digestion issues. And it's now being thought of as potentially, a miracle kind of cure for all types of addiction.
Wow. So is it being prescribed that way now by doctors?
Sure. So some doctors are prescribing it, but doing it off-label, which means the drug itself hasn't been approved for those purposes. But you can do that with all kinds of drugs. You can prescribe them for things in which the drug is not specifically designated for.
Like aspirin and heart attacks.
Exactly. So that's what's happening, is that some physicians are prescribing them for people off-label. The challenge with that is that when you prescribe something off-label, in the case of GLP-1s in particular, health insurers aren't covering it. So you've got to find a way to pay for it. You take a drug like Ozempic, it's extremely expensive. A month's supply can run you over $1,000. And a lot of folks, certainly the women that we interviewed for this story, don't have that kind of money. And so, you've got to find a way to get access to this medication through other means. In this case, the nonprofit that we wrote about, Open Doors, had raised money for it. And so they were able to buy the medications for the women. But that's a huge challenge until this is approved by the FDA for addiction-related purposes. Then the drug itself is going to be, difficult to access for millions of Americans. I mean, they say something like 48 million Americans have an addiction of some form, and only about 3% of those folks actually take a medication to address that addiction. So there's a huge need here.
So this all sounds like a wonderful discovery, minus the expense of it, perhaps, and the health insurance of it all. What's the downside then? Why aren't we celebrating this? That there's a break in the clouds here for addiction.
I think people are celebrating it. The people that are taking the medication that have managed to turn their lives around, I think they're celebrating it. I just think that because the science is so new and because, again, access to the medications is so limited, I just feel like this hasn't really broken out in the open in a way that the wider public knows about it and can celebrate it.
But there's no other downside?
Honestly, I'm not aware of a downside. I mean, to be clear, some of the women we interviewed for this story did say that they, at least initially, they had some side effects from the medication, some nausea, some other side effects, but those kind of faded over time. I guess you could say that, one elephant in the room is what happens when you take these medications and then there's a point in time in which you no longer take them. They've done studies and found that when people stop taking GLP-1s, the cravings return. When people stop taking Ozempic for weight loss, that they actually regain the weight. So I think there's a concern here that if you start prescribing this for addiction, that there will be a point in which when they're no longer on the medications, that their cravings for cocaine or alcohol or heroin, you name it, will return. And that's a concern because if you have stopped using a substance as powerful as heroin for a period of time and then you end up going back to it, then your tolerance is much reduced and your risk of overdose is much, much higher.
That sounds like a pretty big downside, yeah.
That is a pretty big downside. So, I mean, I think the solution there is to figure out a way that this can be approved for addiction, that it can be covered by insurance, that it could be covered by Medicaid. And so there is this kind of growing grassroots movement to achieve that.
So do you think, based on what you know about how people go through recovery, that there's a possibility that they'll be prescribed something, stay on it for just as long as they need to stay on it to figure out other ways to cope with those cravings and get clean and then safely get off of them? Or are they going to be on them for the rest of their lives?
So I think the idea is, at least with the program we wrote about, is it was almost like the medications were like training wheels, right? I mean, to help you kind of get stable. And then during this time in which they're taking the medications, which in this case was a year to 18 months, they would develop other tools, connect with therapy, go to AA or NA meetings, reconnect with families, restore their social networks, find jobs, find housing. Hard to say sober when you don't have stable housing, obviously. And that would give you a foundation that would enable you to go forward. To be clear, I don't think anyone's claiming that this is some kind of like magical cure. by itself. And again, relapse is the nature of recovery. And so there are going to be bumps along the road. I'm sure there are going to be people that are on these medications who are going to end up relapsing. Do you judge it a failure because someone has relapsed? I don't think so. But yeah, I do think that the elephant in the room here is how do you sustain this in a way that people don't just fall off a cliff once they come off it.
What about addictions that are psychological, like gambling?
So they're also finding that this can help with behavioral addictions as well. Again, because this actually affects, the neurons, the receptors in the brain that govern your reward and motivation system. I'm kind of saying that clumsily, but that's essentially what it does. They're finding that it does affect behavioral addictions as well. They have found that in some cases, people that have been compulsive gamblers have found that their desire or craving for gambling has diminished significantly. That again, that noise in the brain that is just almost constant that tells you, I want to drink, I want to smoke, I want to gamble. That is diminished enough that it gives you the space to do other things and to think coherently about why it is you want that. I mean, one of the women that I interviewed told me that she always struggled with these kind of this voice in her brain that would tell her lies. It was like this other person. Some of those lies were, if you just do this one more time, it's not going to hurt. And I think we all can relate to that. But she said with the medication, it was like she could recognize that voice was telling her lies. And she could think dispassionately about it and avoid the impulse.
Wow.
That's a very hard thing to do for many of us as we go about our lives. I think there's huge potential across all forms of addiction, be it substance use and behavioral.
Wow. And it really says something about how much we think about what we think and how we think. I like to think that those little voices in my head are my brain and is me. There's something in my soul or something. But if that could be undone with just chemicals, that's wild. There's just so much of our brain is just chemicals reacting to other chemicals. And you could quiet something that feels like your own voice talking to you and rationalizing with you. You can change that. That's wild. I mean, to an extent, I understand that exists with, SSRIs and things like that. But it's even wilder to think that little voice that tells you this one time is not going to hurt, that rationalization that you do to yourself, that feels like you, but in fact, it can be just a chemical reaction inside your brain. Mm-hmm. This seems so promising. And, there's obviously some downsides with the possibilities of relapsing if you get off of the medications. And how are local doctors and healthcare experts, addiction experts, handling these potential unknowns?
I mean, there's a lot of excitement around this. Mass General Brigham has launched a couple of really exciting clinical trials, one that is examining the potential for GLP-1s to address alcohol use disorder, another one to address opioid use disorder. So they've got these two clinical trials going. We're going to see what those say. And I think we're going to start to see more physicians prescribing these medications off-label for addiction. The challenges there are going to be until this is approved by the FDA for those reasons, then it's going to be difficult to pay for them. And so we're also starting to see more and more recovery groups, grassroots organizations calling for wider access to these and, some coverage of this through our public insurance systems.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for doing it. I welcome the opportunity to shine a light on this and get the word out.
To read more about GLP-1s and addiction, check out Chris's reporting on Globe.com. This episode was made entirely by me. I'm Jasmine Aguilera. Thanks for listening.
Curious about the future of healthcare? Tomorrow's Cure, the chart-topping and Ambie Award finalist podcast from Mayo Clinic, brings it to you today. I'm Kathy Worzer, and in this new season, I sit down with researchers, doctors, and industry experts who are leading the way in medical innovation. From cutting-edge technology to breakthrough treatments, we'll explore how new solutions are improving and even saving lives. Follow Tomorrow's Cure wherever you listen to podcasts.
What is healthy spirituality, and how does it help us thrive? We explore these questions on the new season of Within 4, hosted by me, Dr. Pam King. Within 4 bridges psychology and spiritual wisdom to help you thrive, featuring conversations with experts like self-compassion pioneer Kristen Neff and author-activist Parker Palmer. So go ahead, follow Within 4, hosted by Dr. Pam King, wherever you get your podcasts.